feel like once we start to relate to other people, we start to trust them, and in the trustworthy society, we can trade, we can build, relationships that last. And I feel like that community also kind of helps us not feel isolated. So, can you speak to me more about like what is lost when community disappears, as on an individual level? What have you seen from the research when people go from a community-centered culture to an individualistic-centered culture?
So, communities and cultures are really important for humans because trial and error learning, which is what you have to do if you're a social animal, a solitary animal. It takes a long time to learn how to do something. If you have to learn it through trial and error, you often keep getting things wrong until you get it right. I've said that cooperation is one of the secrets of human success. What that allows us to do is learn very easily from other people. So rather than learn how to do things through trial and error, you can just look at what people around you are doing and learn how to hunt or gather or count or speak or whatever it is that you need to do. And that really makes us successful. In the field of cultural evolution, there's this idea of cumulative culture, where we don't just learn from other people, but we can build on what past people essentially have done as well. This ability to accumulate, for example, technological advances, really has made us very successful as a species. And that only comes from community. If you're an individual who insists on being solitary and refuses to learn from other people, that's not a very efficient way of being a human, in my opinion, or at least it's not how humans have been efficient in the past. So I do think there are dangers to individualism, yeah.
Yeah, I think we often overestimate individualism. I feel like a culture wants to be some people, and grow up. There is a sense of self that comes with individualism, which is a positive, but I think there's also a sense of isolation with that. So, what do you think? This might be a question outside of the field, but what do you think is the balance there, kind of like striking between individualism and also community? How do we merge the two and not lose the good aspects of both?
I think that's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to it. I'm not sure we're doing a good job at it right now. But I think you are absolutely right that individualism isn't entirely bad. I think there are positive things to having a sense of self. But I think you have to have a sense of self embedded in a sense that your family, your community is valuable to you. I think when you start to lose that sense that the community is valuable and that you're more important than everybody else, that's when it becomes a bit toxic. But yeah, you're absolutely right. A sense of self is important. We just need to balance it with a sense of community being important.
And speaking of community, what what have you found about what types of different types of communities that work best? Whether it's small groups or like king networks or like wider tribes or like nation states. What what level of community have you found in your research that work best?
I think it might depend on how you define works best, because obviously we have societies have become more and more complex over time. That's a simplification. That's very much a simplification. Um, but hunter-gatherers communities started off as relatively simple with relatively small groups, although they have interactions with other groups. Hunter-gatherer societies did become more complex over time. Agricultural societies became even more complex, and now we have these nation states where we have these really complex societies, big divisions of labor. We really rely on other people to grow our food, to produce our electricity. All of the things that we need to live are done by many other people. We have these very complex societies, and in some ways that has been a real success story. If you look at mortality, for example, then complex societies in which we have specialized doctors and nurses and medical researchers, for example, mortality rates are much, much lower than they used to be in the past. In the past, sadly, something like half of all children may not have survived childhood and made it to adulthood. In high-income countries today, that proportion of children who don't survive into adulthood is really tiny. So in some senses, these complex states have been incredibly successful, but I think they do have their downsides as well because they've come along with this shift towards individualism, which is perhaps isn't ideal, and may not make us too happy some of the time. Not that natural selection shapes us to be happy. That's not really the end goal of natural selection.
Or sidebar then, what is the end goal of natural selection, you would say?
Well, there is no end goal of natural selection. I shouldn't use that language at all. Natural selection is blind. It's yeah, natural selection selects adaptations which happen to be useful in a particular context. That there's no end goal there, but what makes particular strategies successful is reproducing themselves, essentially, not making themselves happy. So successful strategies in the context of natural selection are those in which allow people to survive better and have children more successfully. And that's why we do, I think, sometimes do things which don't make us happy or healthy for that matter, because our psychology and our physiology too has been shaped by natural selection, which shapes us to be successful in terms of reproductive success, producing children, rather than being happy or healthy.
Yeah, it was a shock to me too when I learned that that you were evolutionarily adapted to produce children rather than be happy, and so sometimes you butt heads with your own kind of evolutionary traits and reasons why you do things, and so on. On fertility now, we want to now touch a little bit on that too. I'm fascinated by this topic because I see there is and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a shift towards a reduction in birth rates, a reduction in birth rates, a reduction in people having kids, and I think coming back to what we talked about before about how allo parenting has now shrunk. It's like there's less people having help when raising children and birthing children. I think there's a lot of people now seeing that and seeing parenting as very difficult and not wanting to be no not wanting to go through that alone. Can you talk to me about the changes and uh how parenting is done has affected fertility rates?
Yes, actually, I'll answer that question in a minute. I just wanted to pick up keep the conversation going about natural selection and happiness. I think, yeah, you were saying that sometimes our evolved tendencies are, butting heads with our desire to be happy. I think it's absolutely fine to want to be happy and healthy. I think it's perfectly fine to have those goals yourself. We shouldn't worry too much about what natural selection has designed us to do. That shouldn't dictate how we live our daily lives. If we want to be happy, then we should absolutely go out there and make sure we are happy and do whatever it takes to get us there. But yes, to answer your question about fertility, do the way we raise children today, is that affecting our fertility? That's your question, right?
Yes.
I think that's a very plausible answer. Fertility rates are declining. So they've been declining in the UK at least since around the middle of the 19th century. So fertility decline is a long process. And it has really complex causes because the issue of fertility itself, fertility decision making, is an incredibly complex thing. Don't know if you're aware, but roughly a little bit under half of all births worldwide are unintended. So a report came out from the UN a few years ago showing that about 45% of pregnancies worldwide are unintended. And part of that is because women and men in some contexts don't have access to good contraception. But a lot of that is also in higher income contexts where people do have access to good contraception, but they're just a bit ambivalent about having kids. So, there are some people who really, really don't want to have a child right now. And there are some people who really, really do want to have a child right now. But there's a big grey area in the middle. And I think a lot of unintended pregnancies are happening in that grey area. Unintended, incidentally, doesn't mean unwanted. Many of those people, when they find out they're pregnant, are absolutely delighted and go ahead with the pregnancy and, have the baby. So fertility decision making is incredibly complex. The reasons for fertility decline are incredibly complex. But I think if you're talking about recent declines in fertility, it does seem likely, plausible to me that the way we organize our families and raise children now is at least part of the reason for fertility decline. Partly is the reason I just said that we're not really gaining much experience now as children of parenting, of raising kids. So we're losing those skills. I think the thought of becoming a parent, if you've essentially had very little contact with babies and small children until you have your own, is quite daunting. People they genuinely don't really know what to do. And again, this comes back to us being a species which relies on social learning from other people in order to do everything. That includes parenting. You're not born with the ability to know how to parent. Even something like breastfeeding is actually really difficult to do if you're not taught to do it, if you don't have support around you. There was a really interesting paper just published by Brooke Skelzer, who works in the Himba pastoralist community in Namibia. They're living quite a traditional lifestyle, but even there, women really need a lot of social support to breastfeed successfully. You would think that something like breastfeeding ought to come very naturally because it's so important. But even that in our species, it's really important to have people around us teaching us how to do it, supporting us how to do that. And we have a lot less of that social support, the way we organize our family lives these days. I also think the nuclear family feeds into this because the nuclear family puts a lot more pressure on parents alone to raise children. If you have these big cooperative networks around you who can help out with childcare, raising children is much easier. If parents alone, pretty much alone, have to raise kids, it's much harder to do that. So yes, I think the answer to your question is yes. The way we organize our families now probably is feeding into low fertility.
Yeah, and I think I've seen that from my perspective, from my experience too, because I think growing up, I was very much around kids all the time. I was looking after nephews and cousins, and so I have this kind of instance that I want my own kids, I want children myself. I think you're right. I think that comes from being around them and seeing being kind of taught how to raise kids. I think another aspect of it too, if I was to think more economically, is that there's loads of economic pressures. You mentioned about the nuclear family. I think right now for a new generation coming up, they feel like it's hard to get home. It's hard to, all these economic pressures kind of dictate or like, kind of give an idea that, parenting might be too difficult. Question I have you found, is there anything you found in the data about maybe that, about how economic pressures sometimes will dictate that, or even thinking about how other cultures and in outside the West, has that affected fertility there too, or?
Yeah, definitely economic factors are really, really important and are definitely another reason for why fertility has declined. There's a lot of work in the literature about how the costs and benefits of raising children change in different types of society. In most traditional societies, both hunter-gatherer societies and agricultural or animal herding societies, children are helping out from quite a young age. In contemporary society, they go to school. So children are not contributing very much to the family. In the past, they always did. And that, to be clear, that's not exploitation. That's how kids learn how to do things. Just as they learn how to parent by caring for their younger siblings, they learn how to become a hunter-gatherer or how to farm or herd animals by starting to do that as a child from a young age and just learning those skills on the job. We learn our skills very differently. We're, isolated in schools where we have to learn specific skills. So kids are no longer contributing to the family economy. That is very likely a big reason why fertility started to decline, because kids just become more expensive to raise. Move to contemporary societies. I think you're right. The contemporary societies as well. There is some evidence that economic uncertainty, precarity, decreases fertility intentions and possibly fertility. And that is one shift, I think, recently that is happening economically. It is getting harder to get on the housing ladder. There's an increase in the gig economy. There's there are fewer stable, well-paid jobs around, I guess, essentially. So yeah, economic factors, economic uncertainty in contemporary societies, I think is very likely also to be feeding into low fertility.
Oh, well, that's a fascinating point you made about the skills and how, like family economy and that aspect of that we don't really have there in the West anymore. As you mentioned, you're going to school and then maybe it's delayed by 18 years if there's going to be any economic kind of profit, let's say. That's a fascinating thing how that would affect maybe the initial decision to have kids or the initial how many kids you do have initially, because the cost of it is so much more backloaded than the front end. The question I have actually, I found in my research that you've also done some work in Ethiopia. Could you tell me more about some of the work, if you would like to, that you've done in Ethiopia, what you're trying to do there,